Everybody, welcome to episode 1 of Red State Rhetoric Media's YouTube channel. We're here, guys. Structured power. Let's dive into it. We're going to get right into it. So, most people believe that power happens in moments. Election night, major speeches, breaking news alerts, and those televised arguments where it feels like history is being decided live and in front of you at home. That's a version that we're shown. The reality is actually quieter than that and a lot earlier. By the time that something reaches your screen, the direction was usually shaped long before the public ever even heard about it. Not in some dramatic movie-style secret meeting, but in planning sessions, in funding strategy discussions, in policy drafting environments, and in regulatory preparation phases that never trend online. It doesn't mean democracy's fake, it just means that the systems move slower and earlier than most people even realize. Let's think about how any major decision actually happens. Before a law exists, there are white papers, and before those white papers, there are research grants. Before those grants, there are funding priorities, and before those priorities, there are threat models, economic forecasts, and strategic planning conversations that never get broadcast to the public. None of it is illegal. Most of it isn't even hidden. It's just buried under layers of process that most people don't have time to follow. And that gap between when decisions start forming and when the public hears about them is actually where real influence tends to thrive and live. Because once something becomes headline news, most of the foundational direction is already set. And at that point, debates usually focus on the details of it, not the trajectory. You could actually see this pattern across industries and across governments. Technology regulation rarely starts when Congress holds hearings. Security policy rarely starts when agencies make public announcements. And economic policy rarely starts when the bill hits the floor. Those are usually late stage signals. The early stage happens where incentives get shaped, where investment flows decide what becomes possible, what becomes scalable, and what becomes politically viable years down the line. And most voters never actually even see that phase because it doesn't look dramatic. What it looks like is meetings, draft language, research funding decisions, and long timelines that don't make for good television. The disconnect creates something important, though. People think that policy changes are now sudden. People think enforcement shifts are the reactions. People think that technology adoption is spontaneous. But in reality, most of it is actually the result of pressure building slowly inside systems that are designed to think in 5-year, 10-year, and sometimes 20-year horizons. It doesn't automatically make those systems corrupt, though, but it does mean that they operate on a timeline completely different from public opinion cycles. And when you start looking at power through that lens, not as events, but as a structure, you start seeing why the outcomes can feel inevitable by the time that they're announced. You also start understanding why certain debates feel like they're missing context. It's mostly because they are. The conversations begin at the end of the decision line, not at the beginning. And that's what we're going to unpack in this video, guys. Not personalities, not headlines, not partisan talking points, but we're going to look at how power actually forms, how influence actually moves, and why so many decisions feel like they've arrived fully built before the public even knows they were being designed. Because if you understand where the decision starts, you stop being surprised at where they end. If you really want to understand how modern power moves, you have to stop looking at the final votes and the public speeches. The real shaping phase usually happens earlier, when something is still being studied, modeled, or framed as a problem that needs solving. Most major policy directions start with a trigger, a crisis, a technological shift, a security concern, or a long-running economic pressure. And once that trigger exists, Research bodies, think tanks, universities, private contractors, and government analysts all start working on possible solutions, often at the same time, and often without the public paying any kind of attention. The first question is rarely, what law should we pass? The first question is usually, is this technically possible? Is this scalable? Is this legally defensible? And can the workforce support it? And can the taxpayers afford it long term? At that stage, the conversation is then dominated by specialists, economists, engineers, legal scholars, national security planners, and infrastructure experts. The output of that phase becomes white papers, feasibility studies, internal memos, and pilot programs. None of that is built for viral headlines. It's built for decision makers who need proof that something can actually work. Money enters early, but not always in the way that people think. Funding often flows through research grants, pilot contracts, consulting studies, and technology partners. When a concept starts proving viable, larger funding sources start then paying attention because now it's no longer theoretical, it's deployable. Then comes alignment. Agencies begin coordinating with each other. Private industry evaluates whether building around this policy direction would be profitable. Workforce training pipelines adjust if new skills will be required, and universities update programs if entire sectors are about to tremendously expand. By the time that legislation is drafted, it's usually translating something that already exists in concept form into an actual enforceable structure. That's why laws often look technical, dense, and procedural, because they're trying to codify systems and not invent them from scratch. This is also why major structural changes can feel sudden to the public from the outside and looks like the politicians are deciding on something quickly. And from the inside, it often reflects years of preparation, testing, modeling, and negotiation between groups that operate far outside of the daily news cycle. And this is where influence becomes more subtle. Influence is rarely about one person making a decision. It's about shaping what options are even considered realistic. If you control the research direction, the funding priorities, or the feasibility narrative, you can then quietly narrow the range of outcomes long before any vote actually happens. And that doesn't automatically mean corruption. Sometimes it's just how complex systems function. But it does mean that public conversation often starts at the end of the story, not the beginning. If you only watch election cycles, press conferences, and legislative floor debates, you're seeing the final chapter. The earlier chapters are written in technical language, budget strategy documents, and regulatory drafts, and long-term planning meetings that rarely hit the headlines. And once a system reaches full implementation, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Not because of ideology alone, but because entire industries, workforces, compliance systems, and financial structures may already depend on it continuing to exist. Understanding that timeline is the difference between reacting to policy and understanding where the policy actually comes from. Most people assume large-scale policy or infrastructure begins when leadership publicly announces a direction. But in reality, the earliest movement usually begins when institutions start preparing for something they believe is coming, even if nobody has officially declared it yet. This preparation phase rarely shows up in the headlines because it does not look like decision making. It looks like planning, contingency work, and it also looks like scenario modeling, early procurement adjustments and discussions, staffing forecasts, and small quiet adjustments to long-term strategic goals. Inside the government, this often starts when intelligence assessments, economic trend data, or technological capability projections start pointing towards future pressure points. And once that happens, agencies do not wait for political confirmation to start preparing internally. They begin mapping what capacity would be required if certain conditions really do materialize. For example, if migration pressure is projected to increase over a decade, the agencies will not wait for a crisis year to begin thinking about infrastructure, staffing levels, or even processing capabilities. And if cybersecurity threats are projected to evolve, planning then begins long before the public sees new defensive frameworks appear in budget documents. That kind of early motion is not even unique to government. Large corporations actually operate in the same exact way. Major banks don't wait for recessions to begin modeling liquidity stress. Technology firms don't wait for regulation to pass before designing compliance pathways. Energy companies also don't wait for demand spikes to begin expanding production capacity. So what makes a government different is its scale and its timeline. Federal systems often have to plan across multiple election cycles, meaning preparation has to be insulated from short-term political change. And that creates planning environments where the goal is continuity, not visibility. Once preparation begins, outside actors will then start aligning around those signals. Defense contractors monitor long-term procurement trends. Technology firms will then track federal research grant direction, and venture capital flows where public funding signals future market expansion. Universities expand programs based on where the government demands suggests future workflow shortages. And none of this requires secret coordination, by the way. It happens because everybody is reading the exact same signals and trying to position just early enough to benefit or even survive. And over time, this creates something that looks like convergence. Different sectors then begin moving towards the same direction without a single central command forcing them to do it. Government planning suggests demand, and industry prepares to supply, finance prepares to fund, and workflow pipelines prepare to train. And by the time elected officials are publicly debating policy structure, multiple layers of preparation may already be in place. But this does not mean exactly that the outcomes are locked. It does mean that the range of realistic options is already narrower than most public debate acknowledges. And this is one of the biggest reasons structural change often feels faster than it really actually is. The visible phase, legislation, the public announcements, and the regulatory rollout is only the final layer placed on top of groundwork that might have been forming for decades. The public sees the launch, institutions experienced the buildup. And once those multiple systems, guys, have aligned around an expected future, reversing that course requires more than political will. It requires rebuilding entire supply chains, retaining workforces, rewriting the compliance structures, and renegotiating financial commitments that might already be contractually locked in. And that is why large-scale change almost never moves in clean, dramatic shifts. It moves gradually through preparation layers that only become visible when they are already mature enough to survive public scrutiny. Understanding that process changes how you might interpret power. Instead of asking when something was announced, you're going to start asking when preparation began. Instead of asking who signed the final document, start asking who shaped that environment where that document became necessary. And when you start looking at systems that way, you begin to see how direction forms long, very long before the public is invited even into the conversation. One of the biggest misconceptions about power is the idea that decisions happen when they become public. In reality, public visibility is usually the closing phase of a much longer chain of events. Long before something shows up in the headlines, it has normally been stress tested in technical environments. Analysts have modeled the costs. Engineers have tested whether the concept actually functions at scale. Legal teams have mapped out where challenges might come from. Risk planners simulate failure scenarios, and budget offices run long-term projections to determine whether something can be maintained across multiple administrations. At that stage, the conversation is no longer ideological, it is actually mechanical, and the focus is survival. Can the system exist long enough to justify building it? Once the early validation clears, attention begins shifting from experimentation to durability. And this is where institutional gravity starts forming. Funding becomes less experimental and more committed. Agencies begin informal coordination before formal announcements have ever even happened. Private sector actors start adjusting long-term strategy. Because if a system looks inevitable, then positioning early is actually becoming an advantage. Workforce planning quietly shifts, and training programs then expand in anticipation of future demands. And nothing about this stage is dramatic at all. It's kind of boring. It looks like planning. It looks like paperwork. It looks like multi-year strategy documents and technical review meetings most voters, never even see. But this is actually where direction hardens. Because once multiple systems begin moving in parallel, momentum becomes self-reinforcing. Budget begins depending on it, supply chains begin adjusting around it, contractors will build the infrastructure for it, and compliance frameworks start forming in anticipation. And at that point, the conversation inside the institutions change tone. The question stops being whether something should exist. The question becomes how to structure this so it can survive legal scrutiny, budget negotiations, and operational realities across changing political leaderships. And that is usually where draft regulatory language begins forming, not as a creative exercise, but as a translation layer. And the goal is to convert an already tested concept into something courts can interpret consistently and agencies can actually execute without ambiguity. And by the time elected officials debate the final language, most of the structural framework already exists in principle. The public debate focuses on then visible outcomes because that is the only part most people are actually exposed to. Inside large institutions, however, focus shifts around continuity. Stability becomes priority. Predictability then becomes currency. If a framework is already supporting contractors, compliance structures, training pipelines, and multi-year financial commitments, then dismantling it becomes extraordinarily expensive. Not politically expensive, but structurally. And structural cost is something that large organizations resist, regardless of who's in power. This is why certain programs rarely disappear completely once they reach maturity. They actually evolve. They get rebranded. They merge into other systems and they expand into adjacent functions. But full removal is uncommon unless a permanent replacement structure is already being engineered and ready to deploy. This pattern exists across sectors. You see it in energy grids. You see it in telecommunications infrastructures. You see it in defense procurement. You see it in large-scale financial regulation, and you see it in emerging technology governance. Large systems do not move fast because speed introduces instability. Instead, they move early, then gradually layer protection mechanisms around themselves, then settle into permanence. To the public, it often feels like transformation happened overnight. Inside planning environments, it usually feels like the final step in a sequence that might have started decades earlier. That difference in perception is one of the biggest reasons public debate often feels disconnected from institutional actions. Citizens react to the announcements. Institutions are responding to the planning cycles already in motion long before public tension arrived on the issue. GAP is not automatically malicious. In many cases, it is structural, built into how complex societies coordinate risk and resource allocation. But it does create a reality most people are never shown. Real power is rarely loud when it is forming. It is quiet, it is procedural, it is buried in technical language and long-range planning documents most people will never read. And once durability is achieved, reversing that direction becomes far more difficult than most political debates even acknowledge. You don't just argue against the system, you have to replace it with something that performs better, costs less, survives legal challenges, and then maintains operational continuity. And that is an incredibly high bar. And it explains why these outcomes feel predetermined by the time that they become public conversation. And once you understand that process, you stop looking only at the moments, and now you'll start looking at the trajectories. And trajectories are where long-term power actually lives. If you zoom out far enough, you start seeing something most political conversations never really map clearly. Public authority and private capability have always been intertwined for decades, and that relationship has only grown stronger as technology, finance, and national security have now merged into one operational space. And this is not new. This is structural. The United States government has always relied on private industry for execution at scale. The DoD as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman building systems that the military then operates. NASA has depended on private contractors since the Apollo era. Intelligence agencies have historically worked with private technology firms to build tools they cannot develop internally fast enough. And that model did not start in the modern era. It accelerated after World War II and expanded during the Cold War. And then it transformed again after September 11th, when intelligence, surveillance, and data analysis became core national security priorities. When you look at modern surveillance infrastructure or even digital identity conversations, you're going to start seeing kind of the same pattern repeating. The government sets direction and requirements, private industry builds the operational layer, and then regulatory framework grow around whatever proves workable. And that's where figures like Peter Thiel get mentioned in public debate, not necessarily because of conspiracy narratives, but because of documented influence inside technology investment and defense-adjacent companies. Through early backing of companies like Planeteer, Thiel helped finance tools and later became embedded in government analytics and intelligence workflows. Planeteers held contracts with the DoD and ICE and other federal agencies. That is public record. And when you look at immigration enforcement tech today, you're not just looking at the agents on the ground. You're actually looking at the data systems, the analytics platforms, the biometric processing infrastructure, contractor-built case management software, and interagency data sharing agreements. Those do not appear overnight. They get built through procurement cycles that can run for years. Policy advisors also matter here, but not in the way people usually imagine. Somebody like Stephen Miller, when serving in policy roles tied to immigration strategy, influences direction at the policy framework level. And that means defining enforcement priorities, legal strategy direction, and administrative interpretation of existing law. But once policy direction is set, execution spreads across agencies, contractors, technology vendors, and even compliance ecosystems that operate semi-independently of political turnover. And that is why administrations can change their tone faster than they can change the infrastructure. If a system already exists, then its contracts are active. If workflow pipelines are trained and if data architecture is already deployed, then removal is rarely immediate. More often, systems get repurposed, narrowed, expanded, or even reinterpreted depending on political leadership. The DHS, for example, is not one monolithic operational block. It's actually a network of sub-agencies with independent procurement, independent training structures, and independent operational doctrine, all layered under shared strategic directions. Once private industry becomes deeply integrated to those structures, the relationship then becomes symbiotic. Government needs private speed and innovation. Private industry depends on government contracts for long-term stability and scale. None of that automatically means corruption, however. It does mean incentives beginning alignment. And when federal large contracts exist, entire sectors can grow around them. Cybersecurity firms, AI data labeling companies, biometric hardware manufacturers, and compliance auditing firms, and consulting firms that help agencies implement policy at scale. That is where lobbying enters. But not always as a backroom deal making. Much of modern lobbying is technical translation. Industry groups explain what's feasible, what's affordable, what can be deployed quickly, and what could create supply chain risk if implemented way too fast. Organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, defense associations, and technology policy coalitions frequently submit technical policy recommendations during rulemaking processes. And those documents are public, but they're rarely read outside of policy circles. Congressional committees also rely heavily on expert testimony, and when the House Homeland Security Committee or Senate Intelligence Committee holds hearings, they are not just listening to the politicians, they're also hearing from contractors, academics, and policy researchers who help shape the technical narrative around what is possible. And that creates a feedback loop. Government defines the problems, industry proposes solutions, policy frameworks adjust based on technical reality, funding follows systems that demonstrate scalability, and workforce training pipelines then adjust to support whatever systems survive early testing. And once that loop is fully operational, it then becomes extremely difficult to separate public power from private execution. And again, this is not automatically sinister. It's just how large-scale societies coordinate complex systems. But it does mean that the public conversation usually happens after technical direction is already stabilized. If you only watch speeches, campaign promises, and headline legislation, then you are seeing the visible surface of something that's been moving quietly through contracts, research partnerships, advisory committees and boards, and multi-year planning cycles very long before most voters ever hear the topic discussed on their TV. And that reality is uncomfortable for people across the political spectrum, because it does mean influence is rarely dramatic. It is procedural, it is negotiated, it's incremental, and it is usually invisible until the final implementation stage. Understanding that relationship between public authority and private capability is one of the most important keys to understanding modern power, because power today is not just about who writes the law, it is about who builds the systems that make that law operational. Once systems exist and begin operating at scale, another layer activates, and that is the narrative layer. Not in the sense of propaganda or secret coordination, but in the very real way complex policy gets translated into language that the public can understand quickly and clearly. Most people do not read regulatory filings. Most voters do not track federal procurement databases. And most citizens, they don't follow congressional subcommittee hearings or even interagency technical memos. That is not a failure of the public. It's actually a function of time. See, modern governance is way too complex for most people to follow at the document level while living their normal lives. So, interpretation then gets outsourced. Major media organizations, policy commentators, political organizations and campaigns, advocacy groups and think tanks all begin explaining the same systems but through different lenses. The New York Times might frame something through institutional stability. Fox News might frame the same development through federal overreach or security necessity. NPR might frame it through administrative function and social impact. Independent outlets might even focus on the cost, the civil liberties, or the technological implications. And none of those are automatically wrong, but each frame determines where the public attention lands. And what rarely gets discussed is how late the narrative phase usually arrives compared to the technical phase. By the time something becomes a major media conversation, the core architecture is already in place. Funding streams exist. The contracts are now active. Agencies have trained staff and vendors have built deployment pipelines. The public debate is often about the expansion, the limitation, or oversight, not the initial creation. Public opinion then feeds back into political pressure, which can then influence how aggressively systems get expanded or even restricted. And that's where protests, elections, and public discourse actually matter. But they are usually interacting with the systems that are already operational, not theoretical. This is why political messaging often sounds so simplified compared to policy reality. Right? Campaign messaging is built to move millions of voters very fast, quickly. Policy implementation is built to survive those legal challenges, budget oversight, technical audit, and multi-agency coordination. The gap between those two communication styles creates distrust. Voters hear simple promises, then they see slow technical implementation. That feels like betrayal, even when it is sometimes just bureaucracy moving at the speed bureaucracy always moves. And social media, it accelerates this effect. Platforms like X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram compress complex policy into viral fragments. That does not mean that social media is bad, it just means that attention becomes event-driven. Outrage cycles are short, policy cycles, those are long. And a surveillance contract negotiated over 3 years will rarely trend, while a single enforcement video will. And because public perception is driven by what is visible, policymakers often react to what is politically visible, even when the underlying system has been developing quietly for years. That creates moments where it looks like policy changes overnight, when in reality only the public's visibility changed overnight. You could actually see this in how surveillance debates have evolved. The Patriot Act debates in the early 2000s centered on terrorism prevention. Later debates then shifted toward data privacy. And today, conversations include AI, predictive analytics, and biometric integration. The system expanded technically first, and then the public narrative followed each step later. This is also why words matter so much. The same system can be described as security infrastructure, public safety technology, surveillance expansion, or even digital governance architecture, depending on who is speaking where. Each phrase shapes public reaction differently. Political leadership also understands this. So do advocacy groups, and so do media outlets. Language is not just a description, guys. It is positioning, and it determines whether the public sees something as protection, risk, necessity, or even overreach. And once a narrative solidifies, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse the public's perception, even if technical realities actually do change. That's why messaging wars often matter as much as policy drafting. And not because messaging creates reality, but because messaging determines how much political room exists to expand or restrict reality. Public consent rarely happens in a moment. It happens slowly, People adjust to the systems over time, and what once felt extreme can actually start feeling normal if it becomes routine. That does not mean that people stop caring. It just means that attention moves to the next visible crisis while other systems now become background infrastructure. And that is one of the most important dynamics to understanding modern governance. Systems stabilize first, narrative stabilize second, and then public acceptance or rejection, those will usually happen third. And by the time the public fully understands a system, it's usually already embedded deep enough that removing it would require rebuilding entire operational ecosystems around it. And that's why narrative control, media framing, and public perception are not side effects of power, they are part of how power becomes durable. Because no system lasts long term without some level of public acceptance, even if that acceptance is passive rather than enthusiastic. And once acceptance stabilizes, systems stop feeling new, they start feeling inevitable. One of the most misunderstood parts of modern policy and infrastructure is how systems grow after they are built. Not through dramatic announcements, not through one sweeping law, but through gradual expansion, driven by practicality, budget logic, and institutional momentum. Most large-scale government or private public systems begin with a narrow justification, like national security, public health, public safety, health monitoring, financial fraud protection, and border control. The initial scope is usually specific enough to gain funding and political support because targeted solutions are easier to defend publicly and legally. But once a system exists, new possibilities appear almost immediately. If a data system can track one category of threat, analysts are naturally going to ask whether it could help track another. If a monitoring network can operate in one region, planners will ask, scaling nationally would lower per unit cost. And if software can detect one pattern of activity, the engineers, they're going to test whether it can detect adjacent patterns using the exact same infrastructure. None of that requires conspiracy. It requires budget, efficiency, logic. And congressional committees tend to favor expanding existing infrastructure over funding entirely new programs. It's cheaper, it's faster, and it is easier to justify to the oversight boards. That is why expansion often appears inside budget renewals, pilot extensions, or scope adjustments rather than brand new headline legislation. You can actually see versions of this across multiple admins and parties. After September 11th, intelligence sharing systems built for counterterrorism expanded into broader law enforcement coordination. Under both Republican and Democrat leadership, data integration between agencies continued expanding because once interoperability exists, removing it creates a blind spot. During the Obama administration, federal digital infrastructure modernization accelerated to handle healthcare data and federal service delivery. During the Trump admin, border enforcement tech and data analytics investment expanded significantly through DHS and ICE funding streams. During the Biden administration, domestic extremism monitoring frameworks and cybersecurity infrastructure funding increased across federal agencies, each phase built on infrastructure that already existed. None of those transitions happened in a single dramatic switch. It actually happened because the underlying architecture was already there. Private sector partnerships also helped accelerate this effect. When companies invest billions into building compliant technology stacks, they naturally seek additional contracts to make that investment profitable. That does not automatically mean corruption, though. It does mean market logic interacting with government procurement cycles. Defense contractors, cloud computing providers, data analytics firms, biometric technology vendors, once they build a system that works at a federal scale, expanding it use across multiple agencies becomes financially logical and operationally efficient. Another factor is workforce specialization. Once thousands of people are trained to operate a system, shutting that system down creates an economic disruption. Entire career tracks form around maintaining infrastructure, and universities create degree tracks. Certification programs appear, and supply chains stabilize around supporting that entire system. At that point, the system's no longer just policy, it's employment. It is regional economic activity. It is long-term contracting revenue. It is technical expertise that cannot be easily replaced. And when that system reaches that stage, debates then shift. Instead of asking whether that system should exist, conversations then shift towards how it should be governed. Oversight replaces existential debate, right? Regulation then replaces elimination. The transition happens quietly, but it is one of the biggest signals that the system has become permanent infrastructure. There's also a psychological component, right? The public adapts to systems that remain stable over time. Something controversial at launch could become routine if it becomes predictable. Routine lowers emotional reaction. Lower emotional reaction lowers political urgency. And lower urgency reduces that pressure to dismantle systems even when the people still have concerns about them. Historical examples, so it's like they showed this pattern. The IRS data infrastructure expanded over decades as tax complexity increased. The FAA airspace monitoring network expanded as aviation scaled globally. NSA data collection capacity expanded as global digital communications exploded. And financial transaction monitoring expanded after major fraud and money laundering cases forced new regulatory standards. None of those systems exist today in their original forms. They've evolved because the environment around them has changed, and because the cost of replacing them entirely would also be enormous. What matters is not whether expansion happens. It's going to. It almost always does. What matters is whether expansion is transparent, legally reviewed, and then publicly understood. The most stable systems are not the ones that never change. They are the ones that change slowly enough that oversight, courts, and public awareness can keep up with them. And when expansion happens faster than understanding, that is when the trust erodes. And when expansion happens with clear legal frameworks and public explanation, systems tend to stabilize with a lot less backlash. And this is where modern governance gets extremely complicated. Technology is evolving faster than law. Law is evolving faster than public awareness, and public awareness is evolving faster than institutional reform. So systems often move forward simply because reversing them would require rebuilding entire sections of government, industry, and workforce training pipelines simultaneously. That is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just the structural reality of it. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing why major infrastructure decisions rarely are moving backwards quickly. Not because nobody wants any kind of change, but because the cost of unwinding those systems increases exponentially the longer that they exist. And that is why the most powerful moment in any system's life cycle is not when it is fully deployed, it is when it is first approved, because that is when the future expansion potential is quietly locked in. If you step back and look where the world is actually headed right now, the biggest shift is not political parties trading power back and forth. The real shift is how decision-making itself is changing. See, modern governments are operating in an environment where speed matters more than ever. Economic shocks move globally in hours. Cyber threats happen in milliseconds, and supply chains can collapse overnight. Military conflicts now include digital infrastructure, satellites, and financial systems combined all in one, all at once. That pressure forces institutions to then rely on systems that can process massive amounts of information quickly. Not for drama, not for ideology, but for survival and competitiveness on a global stage. The United States is currently watching China build tightly integrated state technology infrastructure. Europe is building regulatory-driven digital governance systems. Private technology companies are building platforms that governments increasingly depend on to just function at scale. And once that dependency exists, it's changing how the power operates. Because the question stops being who is elected and starts including what systems are already running underneath whoever gets elected. Across multiple administrations, regardless of party, federal agencies expanded data sharing capabilities, predictive modeling tools, and automatic risk assessment systems. The DoD accelerated AI-assisted logistics and threat modeling. The Treasury Department expanded financial tracking capabilities tied to sanctions and global capital movement. Health agencies built national-scale modeling infrastructure during crisis response periods. Different leaders, different messaging, same structural trajectory. Because one predictive capability already exists, leaders see it as a risk management, and no administration wants to be the one caught blind during a crisis. But predictive systems don't exist in a vacuum. They're built by contractors, cloud providers, research institutions, and private sector partners. Companies like Planeteer built large-scale data integration tools for defense and intelligence environments. Cloud infrastructure providers like Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure became embedded into public sector operations across multiple levels of government. That doesn't automatically equal control, and it doesn't mean conspiracy theory, but it absolutely equals influence because infrastructure determines what's possible. If a government depends on a certain digital architecture to run core systems, policy choices then begin to orbit around what that infrastructure can fully support. That is where long-term power lives now, inside technical capabilities, not just political speeches. At the same time, new experiments are happening globally. Private charter cities, special economic zones with alternative regulatory models, digital jurisdiction concepts tied to remote work and distributed finance. Most of these will stay small, some will fail, but a few will shape how future governance gets designed. And none of this is happening in isolation. Governments are trying to maintain sovereignty. Corporations are trying to maintain competitive advantage. Citizens are trying to maintain privacy and autonomy. And foreign powers are trying to gain strategic leverage. That tension, it's permanent. There is no final end state. There is only constant negotiation between these forces. The future is not controlled by one election. It's shaped by the systems that remain in place across those decades. Because when infrastructure becomes essential and when entire industries, security frameworks, and economic models rely on it, removing it becomes almost impossible without massive disruption. So, if you understand where society is going, you can't only watch campaign cycles or breaking news alerts anymore. You have to watch where the research funding is moving. You have to watch which technologies quietly move from experimental to required. You have to watch which private companies and governments slowly begin depending on each other to operate. Because once something becomes essential, it stops being debated and starts becoming maintained. And that is the real takeaway today from everything that we've covered in this video. Power rarely appears suddenly. It builds through planning, technical feasibility, funding alignment, and long-term coordination between institutions most people never directly see. So if you understand where the system begins, you understand why outcomes feel inevitable by the time that they reach the public stage. If you made it to the end of this, seriously, much respect, thank you. This is the first long form drop from this channel, and this is the direction that we will be going from here on out. Less noise, more structure, more document-driven investigations, and more real conversations about how power is actually moving in our country. If you want more of this, subscribe, stay plugged in, and drop your thoughts below. Guys, I'm reading everything, every single thing. I will be replying to it all as well, because this is not the channel telling you what to think. We are just trying to give you the tools to see how actual systems are moving and how they actually work. And we're just getting started. As always, we are Red State Rhetoric Media, LA's #1 non-biased independent news station, TikTok's last free land of opinion and speech. We don't spin the facts here. We just expose them. Thanks for watching, and we love you guys. Catch you in the next one.